Other than Tuesday, that's my note. There are next. Somewhere, you know.
So there is no home that's.
Yeah. Yeah, there is maybe they're ready after that, so. Make sure they're. So, if I say. When I say something, I think.
You need a lot to be done.
Michelle Lee Moore is coming in online.
Okay, wonderful. Good morning. Oh, I feel the, attention and, the expectation rising. So welcome, wonderful to see all of you on a beautiful October morning. And let me start off our session today by underlining that we acknowledge and respect the Lekwang, Songhees, Muslim, and Hispanic peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the San peoples whose historical relationship with this land continues to this day. And with this land acknowledgement, I think we will enter a fascinating discussion about a different kind of indigenous rights issues, colonial legacies. But Arvind will take us into a very different part of the world. And I think this is what the Center for Global Studies can actually do when it comes to thinking about the history of colonialism, treatment of indigenous peoples, their rights, their quest for self-governance, to adopt an international comparative perspective. And so I'm very grateful to be able now to be enlightened by Arvind about the fate of the Adivasi and Dalit movements in India. With this, let me introduce, I think most of you know Arvind by now quite well. Arvind Kumar has been around as a fellow at the center here and at CSRS. And he is currently a PhD student in the law program, so the Law Society program here at UVic, but he came to UVic already with a law degree. As you can see here in 2019, he graduated from law from National Law University in Lucknow in India, and he has his LLM and access to justice from Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. And then I think this is what is quite particular and distinctive about Arvind's career, that he then puts his legal background and credentials to good use by working with different communities, particularly Dalit and Adivasi communities, to support their claims and to address issues from a legal perspective. So I'm very grateful for Arvind taking the time and being available today, talking about basically, I think it is your PhD research, I assume, that we will hear about. So beyond the colonial and post-colonial binary, very much an issue that is of crucial interest to many of us here at the center. So Arvind, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oliver, for the kind introduction, and really thankful to CFGS for giving me this opportunity to share my work here. So it's always hard for me to explain the complexities of the Indian society, especially in this part of the world. So I will try my best to get you through this whole presentation and help you understand what I'm really trying to make sense in it. So it's a diverse community, South Asia. And especially I'm focusing on India, so obviously India is a very diverse society with all kinds of religions, traditions you can imagine exist there. But primarily, let's say the most major traditions are let's say Hinduism, Buddhism is there, Sikhism is there, Islam is there. The two main big traditions are population-wise is Islam and Hinduism, right? So I will not be focusing on other traditions, but I will be focusing mostly on the Hindu society, which comprises around 80% of the Indian population. And within that big umbrella term of Hinduism or Hindu community, I will be focusing on two communities. One is the Adivasi community and the other is the Dalit community. So Adivasis are the people. So it's a self-identified term which is used by the people who claims to be the original inhabitants of India. And they mostly reside in, let's say, the central part of India or the eastern part of India and the northwestern part of India. My research is mostly focused on in the province of Jharkhand, which I inserted with the red line. So it's a huge community. It's a very diverse community, which mostly lives in the forested regions of the country. And in India, like the Indian state doesn't recognize any group as indigenous. They say that all people belonging here are indigenous. There used to be like indigenous claims in pre-independence era, but after like independence, the Indian state decided that everyone should be treated as indigenous. So there is no discussion at all within the Indian state framework about who is indigenous or who is not indigenous. So that's why the state uses different terminologies to refer to the Adivasi people, and the term is scheduled tribes. So it's an administrative term which the Indian state uses to provide some privileges within the academia and other parts of the state institutions. And as you can see, it's a huge population. It's like 8.6% of the India's population. It's 106 million people. And as I said, that they are not recognized. But the Supreme Court, like in 2011, around 2011, in one of the judgments claimed that Adivasis are the most possible original inhabitants of the South Asian society or the Indian society. So my research is like mostly focused on Adivasi people and their struggle for self-governance and autonomy. But I'm also bringing my positionality as a Dalit scholar. So it's a term which is used by my community, and which these are the people who have been considered as impure and has been treated as an untouchable within the Hindu society. So it's also like a very diverse community, but their experiences of untouchability brings them together. So the Indian state uses like the scheduled tribes. The Indian state uses the term scheduled caste within the constitutional framework. And it's one of the largest population, like in terms of number, like 16.63% of India's population, which is approximately 200 million. The purpose of like bringing and thinking about these two communities together is because their claims for indigeneity has some parallels with the Indian society, and their struggle against the kind of social systems we have, which we call the caste system, is very similar how they have an experience. The only difference is that the Dalits have been part of the caste system. Adivasis, since they have been living in the forested areas, they were never like came into contact with the caste society as such. So what is like the caste system? So the caste system is like so caste system is like it's an idea of a social order which mostly lies at the heart of the Hindu religious texts, which we call it the Brahmanical tradition. So anything you know about Hinduism is actually rooted in the scriptures, which we call the Hindu scriptures or the Brahmanical scriptures, from Vedas to Dharma Shastras to Mahabharata. Anything and everything you have heard about Hinduism is rooted, that epistemologies are rooted into the scriptures. And one of the major thing about this system is that it believes in a hierarchical world, which is like, if you go back to the most ancient texts, which like there's one text called Rig Veda, so you will find the creation story of how humans came into being. And the idea is that the supreme god Brahma, he like divided the primordial man into 4 groups. So this is how the social groups came into being. From the mouth or the head, he created the Brahmins. From the arms, he created the warriors and the rulers, and from the thighs, he created the Vaishyas, and who are the farmers, traders, and merchants. And then from his feet, he created the most people who were known as the Shudras. So this is like the 4 social order within the Hindu epistemology. But there are other groups who were never seen as part of this order. So those people were seen as very impure, primitive, backward people. and those were the Dalits, untouchables. So they were never considered as part of the caste order, but they were always treated as impure people who lived beside the caste society. And beside that, there are also the people who were living in the forest. So they were never like seen as even considered to be equal to become part of the caste society. So this is like broadly hierarchical order within Hinduism. And you can find that this is the uh, foundational idea of this world beyond this world. So it's not just the humans have been divided in a hierarchical manner, even the whole universe has been divided in a hierarchy. So my research is mostly focused on reading and bringing out these things by doing a critical study of the Hindu scriptures. So this is like the order, and most of the like privileges are decided or it has historically been decided based on these orders. But there is like a lot of things, very complex things, which I don't know if I should bring here in this presentation. It will make it more complex. So I think I'll leave it here just to give an idea what is caste system, what is Hinduism. So one of the things I wanted to bring in here that the idea of a Hindu religion is a 19th century colonial making. When the British came to India, they saw like Islam was there, Christianity was there, so they can recognize them. But they were like diverse traditions, people who were following other traditions, which they were not able to like categorize. So they created this whole umbrella term of Hinduism, in which they brought all together non-Islamic, non-Christian societies under this umbrella term. But while doing so, they did one thing that they made the Brahmins or recognized the Brahmins as the knowledge upholders of Hinduism. And by doing that, they gave legitimacy to the Brahmanical texts, which the Brahmins had been writing for centuries. So this is how like Hinduism, the way we understand today, is actually just synonymous with Brahmanical tradition, without recognizing the diversity of all the traditions which exist there. So Adivasis are included within Hinduism, Dalits are included in Hinduism. Their traditions have been erased, like within that whole umbrella category. So I'll just give you an idea, like the population-wise. So 1931 was the last census. After that, no census has taken place, caste census. So the upper caste mostly like come from the Brahmin, the upper three caste groups. They form around 10 to 15%, approximately based on the 1931 census. Then there are others, Adivasis, Dalits, and Shudras. They mostly form around 80 to 85% of the Indian population. This is also based on like, so the union government, the central government never is not doing any caste census, despite that there is a very high demand from the Adivasis, Dalits, and the other lower caste groups. So there is a movement going on for to conduct the caste census to find out like who are the people who are benefiting from winning state mostly. So if you look at the caste-wise representation, so it's total domination of the upper three caste groups in the state institutions. I'll just give an example of the Supreme Court. So there are 33 judges, and 80% of the space is occupied by the upper caste judges. 34% are Brahmins. And high courts like 80 to 85% is upper caste judges. Women representation is like mostly 38, but these mostly come from the upper caste background. Adivasi and Dalit, who constitute around 25% of the Indian population, they have just 3% representation. In fact, there is no Adivasi judge ever in the Supreme Court. The same situation persists in the academia. So this is like the important point which form the backdrop of my paper and my research. I'm focusing on the academia, like how the academia, the South Asian academia, which is represented by the upper caste groups, have erased the question of caste within the South Asian discourses. So the post-colonial and subaltern scholars who you all are aware of, and they are the ones who decide the South Asian discourse, not here in the West only, and also in India as well. And they mostly draw from Edward Said's work, and they argue that caste and tribe are colonial constructions. Subsequently, they criticize the colonial rule, laws, and epistemologies, and for all the socioeconomic or whatever problems existing in the society. And this, forms the background of the decolonial thought within South Asian studies, where decolonization is synonymous with a critical study of, and dismantling of colonial epistemologies, laws, and institutions. And this is what this whole narrative is something which dominates the decolonial approach discourses within the Indian state as well, which is currently like totally taken up or dominated by the radical forces. And they use these narratives to impose the Brahmanical Hindu scriptures as the sources of India's indigenous laws and institutions. And they claim that the present constitution is a colonial document and it should be discarded. So this is just like an overview of what I thought to bring out. And so there are like Dalit and Adivasi critiques of the subaltern and post-colonial scholars. One of the critique is that it's totally dominated by the upper caste groups. So the narrative they present is basically their own narrative and how they wanted to present the Indian history or Indian society. So they critique that, critique for mostly like erasing the question of caste and Brahmanism's role in establishing and sustaining caste system. So they argue for the pre-colonial roots of caste and Brahmanism's primary role in the construction of the categories of caste and tribe. And they say that, obviously, the problems of the colonial rule are not denied, but they say that the epistemologies which we consider as the roots for creating caste and tribe are not just colonial European epistemologies, but this coming together of two problematic ideas create these epistemologies. So this is how they critique, and they say that if you are not considering these questions, you are denying the thousands of years of oppression of the Dalits and Adivasis in the Indian society. So Dalits mostly critique that based on their own caste oppression of experiences, and they say that though there were regional, variations in pre-colonial India, but the caste system was intact there, where the Brahmins were occupying the high spaces, and then they're like the way I explained you, it goes down, further down, and it was legitimized, sanctified by the Brahmanical Hindu scriptures. Similarly, the Adivasi indigenous scholars, they critique that category of tribe is not just a colonial construction. They say that the way tribe has been categorized in the colonial text is based on the Sanskrit and Hindu religious texts and traditions which describe and depict the tribes in a similar fashion. I mean, there's like a whole list of texts which I thought to bring out here, but I think we don't have much time, so you can read my paper for that. So it would be like, it is argued that it would be a mistaken claim that the categorization of tribe or tribal attributes or tribalness was absent in pre-colonial India, since the categorization of forest dwellers as wild and barbaric people in need of civilization predates the colonial period. And if you look at all the mythologies, you can see that how these peoples have been depicted as demons, as people who needs to be wiped out. I mean, the whole list of like mythologies which has been created to demonize the people. When mythology is a very strong point, how the Brahmanical thought process has demeaned and created the caste system in the Indian society. So besides like noting the contribution of the Hindu text, they have also like noted the role of like the Brahmin and non-Brahmin upper caste elites in making of the colonial epistemology. Because there is this whole idea that it was only the British colonial ethnographers who were creating these ideas. But the epistemologies and they were using, and the people who were like helping them to create these epistemologies, the caste epistemologies, was actually supported by the Brahmin and the non-Brahmin upper caste Hindus as assistant commissioners, as assistant whatever you can think of. All the anthropological or ethnographic institutes were like dominated, manned by these groups. So categorization of, that's what it is argued that was based on the Brahmanic theory of caste classification and was done by the colonial state with the approval of Sanskrit scholars and others well versed in the Vedic tradition. So this is like one of the main critique which comes from the Adivasi and Dalit scholars, that the post-colonial scholars say that the British or the Indologists, Orientalists, whatever you want to call them, they were interested because they were in the Sanskrit texts, and the Hindus are in the Sanskrit text or any text you can imagine from India. It was just that they were full of curiosity to unlock the mysteries of the East. But Dalit and Adivasi critics, scholars critique that it was the usefulness of the caste system which the British recognized to govern India, and that too in the name of indigenous law. And that's why like there is a big collaboration between the upper caste Hindu scholar, the Hindus and the British colonial officials to solidify the caste system, even if it was not solidified in the pre-colonial era. So the caste system became like the dominant ideology or governance model in British India by coming together of these three thought processes. That's why most of the scholars say that it was not just a British rule, it was a British upper caste Hindu rule, or maybe a British Brahmin rule. That's most of the scholars are arguing. So I did my field work with the Adivasi community in 2003 and 2004. And so there's a difference, like the Dalit scholarship is like it has emerged from the community. So it is establishing itself as a study in itself. But the problem with the Adivasi studies is that it is totally dominated by the upper caste Hindu scholars. So most of the time the narrative comes from them, which mostly, in my understanding, doesn't align with what Adivasi people are saying on the ground. And that's what the most of now the Adivasi scholars are coming up. They are also bringing this critique of scholarship. So this movement started in like 2017 as a revolt against the policies introduced by the Indian state. So there was a new policy called the land bank policy. Land bank policy which the Indian state introduced, when huge tracts of land was planned to be taken away from the Adivasi people to give it to the multinational corporations, mining companies. And so this is like the time when, and also like it's a government which is totally, we call it like the Brahmanical government mostly. It's like the government which is like the Hindu right-wing nationalism is mostly like a Brahmanical nationalism. So if you go into the terminologies, the ideologies they are following, it's totally based on like establishing or bringing up or re-establishing the Hindu caste order in the Indian society. So the way they see the Dalits and the Adivasis is like it's like people who needs to be governed, people who needs to be, I don't know, like some scholars use the term like sacrifice for the development of the nation. So that's where like the whole policies were being made, and there were like many laws, like pre-colonial laws, and then there are like post-colonial laws and constitutional provisions which protect the autonomy of the Adivasi people over the land. But this government, to implement the land bank policy, they started like bringing amendments within these laws to like take away that consent provisions from these laws. So mostly like there were like three or four laws which were like being attacked. First one was the Santi Pargana Act. So it came in like 1876, which the Adivasis fought long battle with the British colonial state to get this law, where the British state recognized the hereditary relationship of the Adivasi people with their land. So that law has been protecting the relationship of the people with the land till now. And then there is one in 1908. So all these laws have come out of very violent movements which the Adivasis have fought in the British state. But the post-colonial state decided to keep up those laws. And then there is Forest Rights Act like 2006. And then there are like other constitutional provisions. So the British, like the Indian state, the central government, as well as the provincial government, they brought out these laws, amendments to weaken these laws. And in that whole context, this movement came into being. So some of the strategies like the Adivasi people used was like very varied, but one of the primary things which they did was that they started like putting stone slabs, the way I showed you here, where they wrote declarations, as a message to the Indian state and the outsiders. So there are many like very kind of declarations were there, but these were like the primary declarations you will find there. That like there is a very sacred ceremony related to the stone slabs, and it's used in like as a historical fact. It's used as a historical evidence, and also used as a way to like remember your ancestors as well. So when an elder dies, the Adivasi people bury that ancestor in the forest and they put these stone slabs. So you'll find like millennia old stone slabs there, which is seen as an authority, as a voice of the Adivasi ancestors speaking to the Adivasis in these present times. So this is how they started bringing up this idea to use these, sacred ceremonies to reestablish their sovereignty and autonomy over their land and territory against this onslaught of the post-colonial state. So they put like a lot of declarations, and these were the primary ones that they declared very efficiently that state officials are not allowed to visit in the village, no entry of any outsiders in the village and the forest, and they declared the sovereignty of the traditional laws and governance systems. And they burned most of the villages, they burned their identity documents, they denied the services of the banks and other state services provided by the state. And all these declarations were made by referring to the Constitution of India, the 5th schedule, which talks about their which recognizes their relationship with their land. So, and some of the other major declarations is that they have very categorically said that they are not Hindu and they should not be governed by Hindu law and order. So the Indian state, as I explained in the beginning, that it doesn't recognize these Adivasis as a unique society in itself. So they have been categorized within the Hindu category. So that's one reason why they are protesting against to be governed under the Hindu category. But the other reason is that when you are included in the Hindu religion, you are not included as an equal. You are always given a place in that hierarchical order. And that hierarchy is not like decided by some declaration. It depends on how the upper caste see you, your way of life, whether it's pure or impure. And based on these things, your position in the society would be decided. Your skin color, what you eat, how you dress, what kind of festivals you worship, what kind of gods and goddesses you worship. So all these things are taken into consideration. So this whole resistance against being recognized as a Hindu is rooted in that discriminatory nature of the Hindu tradition. Similarly, like Dalits, they have started moving back to, let's say, the indigenous traditions, which we call, like, let's say, Buddhism. So they are converting to Buddhism, so to as a resistance against the Brahmanical tradition, Brahmanical religion. So, and I don't want to take you again into those complexities, but these are the major reasons why they are resisting against being recognized as a Hindu by the Indian state and by the society. So they are demanding for the recognition of their own religion within the census, which they call the Sarna religion, which is mostly rooted in Adivasi's way of worshipping the nature, the environment, their traditional gods and goddesses. So this is one of the primary one. And there's a very focused study of like the Brahmins and their upper caste hegemony. So if you go to Adivasi areas, you will find that all of the region is like it's Adivasi people who are living. But the center of powers, which are like doesn't go beyond 5 kilometer stretch, those centers are occupied by the upper caste Hindus. So mostly they were brought in those areas by the British rule as moneylenders, as other, other administrators, as state officials. So since they have, then they have been living, but now after the post-colonial, in post-colonial India, since they also occupied the state machinery, they still continues to occupy courts, the bureaucracy, the bank system, or whatever you can imagine. So it's like very, it's very like visible. So the moment you move beyond those 5 kilometers of stretch, it's all Adivasi people with no power at all over the society, over their forest areas. So there is a very strong critique of these communities, which they see them as oppressors. Boycott of Brahmin priests, like it's a resistance again, because of the way the untouchability is now being practiced against the Adivasis. So they see that if you invite a Brahmin priest, they appropriate the Adivasi gods, goddesses, festivals within the Hindu pantheon. So they're resisting against that also by not inviting them as performed over their rituals, their festivals, their marriages, their weddings. So then now they have started reviving their own traditional priestly classes, which were already there. But people were like, for the last 10 or 20 years, maybe not inviting them, or maybe were more dependent on the Brahmin priests. So these are some of the strategies which they are using to protect their identity as a unique identity, besides being absorbed or being absorbed within the Hindu empire. Lifetime.
Yeah.
5 please.
So I don't know if I have done this.
You're only at 33 minutes.
Yeah, so take another 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, so this is like one of the festivals which they celebrate as part of their resistance. And this story goes beyond like in ancient times, where they remember that how their kingdom was taken away by the upper caste Hindu rulers from them. So this festival is like mostly like organized to remember the loss of sovereignty to the outsiders. So it's like, for example, this turban, it represents the turban of their last king, which they call the Madramunda. And this story goes back to like thousands of years. And they celebrate it, to establish the dance. They celebrate it to reclaim their sovereignty over their land through these stories, by reviving and remembering these stories. This is another story which you will find in the Hindu scriptures mostly. So it's a story about the Hindu goddess Durga, and the Adivasis claim that the Mahasasur whom she killed was actually an Adivasi indigenous king. So the story of Durga is like, it's like a myth which you will find in the Hindu scriptures. But the Adivasi people say that this is how, through these stories, the Adivasi kings and society has been demeaned or appropriated within the Hindu pantheon or the Hindu mythologies. So it's one of the ways again where they celebrate their king Mahasasur instead of celebrating the way Hindus celebrate the Durga. So they celebrate their king Mahasasur as their king, as their ancestor, and they see the Durga as an oppressive figure. We will find, it's one of the very primary festivals which is celebrated in India, mostly popular within the Hindu caste groups. But Adivasis resisted by celebrating their own way this festival. So it's a festival which goes for like less than 9 nights. So for 9 nights, like the Adivasis dance around the villages, the forest. So the story is that they are looking for their king who was killed, kidnapped, or whatever. So there's a long story about that. Maybe I'll share something to it. And this story is parallel within the Dalit and Adivasi communities, both when they're defining their indigeneity claims historically. So that's why there is like a strong confusion most of the scholars who have written on Pathalgadi movement till now, they define it as a decolonial expression. But in my understanding, what I have found is that it's more like not like only a decolonial, but it's also a very de-Brahmanical expression, where they are resisting anything and everything which has been imposed by the Brahmanical tradition or epistemologies on the Adivasis. So yeah, I mean, this is one way or just a glimpse of how like what I'm trying to bring out the concept that there is a need to move beyond the way the decolonization has been explained within the South Asian studies. And there is a need to like include the Dalit and Adivasi voices to understand what has really gone wrong in Indian society. So like a decolonial approach, like what I say is that, the current one, very focused on critique of Western colonial epistemology may make sense in countries like Canada, Western settled colonies. But in India, I mean, long before the British colonial rule came into being, these people were like already exploited, oppressed, suppressed by the Brahmanical tradition, which has been going for thousands of years, at least for thousands of years. And so I think a Debrahmanical approach, that's what I'm proposing in my paper and in my work, that it will provide very insight that how these caste and tribe categories have been made, created, recreated, and imposed on people, and how people have been demonized in the Indian society. And I think that it's since the current decolonial discourse doesn't include a critique of the Brahmanical problems, it has that drawback has been misused by the Brahmanical forces, or you can call the Hindu writing forces, to impose Brahmanical laws and like Brahmanical epistemologies in the name of Indigenous laws and epistemologies, hiding the fact that the problems of that epistemology. And this is where the whole resistance is coming into the Indian society. If you look at close, that people are resisting against it. And that's where most of the communities don't see the oppressed communities don't see the Constitution of India, let's say, as a colonial document. They see it as a liberatory document which talks about equality, fraternity, compassion, which is totally absent in the Brahmanical epistemologies. So this is where like a deep Brahmanical approach I'm trying to bring into through my work. And if you need more understanding, I just got published, so you can read it.
Thank you. Your publication, or here we go. Now we know what I know. The answers to your questions already. Do you want to start us off, Steve?
Sure. Thanks very much. Appreciate that. Not something I know very much about or anything about. In fact, I believe this is the first time I've heard the word Debrahmanication. So, it's always nice to learn something new. Okay. So I have a question, sort of continue that line of thought. And that is, you talked about at the outset of the talk, you elided sort of let's say the primary norms and practices of the Indian state with that of Hinduism, right? But there are other traditions available, such as sort of the civic nationalism that was prominent in the mid-20th century. I was just wondering if there was any sort of ideological connection or resources for this struggle that you were talking about that would be available from a civic nationalist perspective, or is that just wholly hostile to an indigeneity sort of focused analysis of the situation?
So are you referring to the Gandhi's movements mostly?
Yeah, like the idea that everybody's Indian, we have a set of rights and regular, sort of the constitutional patriotism of the sort of mid-20th century that, has been sort of run over by, more recent Hindu Bata approaches, but, still remains as you might think it was a well normative availability, but equally at the same time problematic from a Indigenous perspective. So I was just wondering whether, you didn't talk about it, what relations there might be between those two normative frameworks.
Yeah, that's interesting. So like if you look at the development of the Constitution of India, which became like the dominant framework in post-colonial India is actually like, it's not something which came into being just in post-independence India. It was like series of movements which were happening. You can start with Gandhi's movement of civil disobedience. But these movements were again like very like spearheaded by the upper caste Hindus. I mean, Gandhi himself came from that background. So he was trying to bring the people like, under this Hindu identity together to fight against, the British state. But there are like parallel movements which were going on, let's say the Dalit movement, which was going on, which was saying the same thing, which I'm trying to make sense here, that within all these dominant movements, the question of or the problems of Dalits and Adivasis have never been addressed. So the Constitution of India, I think, has emerged out of those movements, but it still lacks, some many measures to address the problems of these two communities. So, for example, like Adivasi sovereignty is not recognized within the constitutional framework yet. There are like protective provisions, but what they're demanding is like complete sovereignty, which has never been addressed. I mean, it has been addressed in some context to, let's say, the Northeast communities. Yeah. So that part of the land is also like inhabited by people who call themselves to be the tribals. They don't use any other term, but they use the term tribal, but they are still, I mean, they and Adivasis claim to be indigenous peoples. So their demands have been met to a certain extent under one schedule of the Constitution, where the Constitution has recognized their traditional laws and governance systems and their sovereignty over their land. But in context of Adivasis, it has never been recognized. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but this is what like have been all these movements which is happening is actually all the movements you might have heard from India have been mostly like dominated and spearheaded by the upper caste Hindu leaders. Dalit and Adivasi movements have started making, maybe are reaching to these parts of the land now after 70 years of independence. So it's like mostly invisible. So yeah. Have I answered your question?
In a way, yeah.
I'm not sure. Let's go.
It's all right, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
The Adivasi community itself, I'm wondering, I'm interested to know more about maybe their language or their ways of living. We know that, as you mentioned, they are living as a tribe. So what's their ways of living, or what's their educational system? Do they have their own, or they are hindered from having like a kind of to enter the educational system, Indian education system?
So yeah, like they have their own languages, they have their own systems, like social systems, laws, but which has never been recognized. So for example, the community I'm working with, the Munda community, so it has like its own language. So they are trying to revive it again. But the Indian state has not recognized it as such, or not has been working as such to promote these languages or their way of life. So, but the Indian state has like there is something we call the reservation system. So certain like seats in parliament, in legislatures, in bureaucracy, in universities has been reserved for as per their population. So for example, 8% of the seats are reserved for the Adivasi community. But it's a very diverse community. For example, there are like Gond communities. They have their own language, which is very different from the Munda community. And so that goes to, there are many like, Oram is there, many communities are there. But I mostly was working with the Munda community, so I can tell about that. But it's a very, very diverse community. But their situation is more or less simple. They have never been made part of the Indian state as such. Despite like seats reserved from them, it is made sure that no professors are hired from these communities. Because there is a very strong resistance by the upper caste lobby against filling these positions. So even like Constitution has made provisions for these people, you will find no professor in any university which has reached the stage of professorship from Adivasi community. So there's a strong resistance which is going on, and that's why there is a very strong demand for caste census to find out like who are the people who are dominating or making most of the use of the Indian state, who are the people who are lagging behind. So the problem is like the population constituted around 85% population has no hold on any of the Indian state institutions. And most of the scholars you have come across in this part of the world, they come from that 10% of the background. And that's where the problem lies, that all their discourses doesn't make sense to me as well, doesn't make sense to the Adivasis as well.
Right, and then Sonia.
Thank you. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you so much, Arvind. I'm glad to see the progress you make over the years. It's been 3 years from the first time I met you in Cafe, right? That's great. Congratulations. I have a couple of questions. First, particularly regarding the strategy that the community used. I wonder, because to me, they use ceremonies, dancing, storytelling. I wonder if you also capture the change after those performance. To me, those kind of cultural performance, right, to fight back culturally. But what change could you observe after that, or do you capture those? Second, go to the deeper level in terms of, like, I remember there's another Catherine. She came here a couple of weeks ago. She talked about 3 different types of violence, right? The direct violence, structural violence, and then the third one is epistemic violence. And I think this one is the third one, right? So how could those cultural performance can fight back, can respond strategically to those deeply seated violence to the community?
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks, good question. To the first question, like yes, they perform, and that's like one of the way they are existing. Especially those dances, festivals are like mean to resist the wrongful appropriation of the land and the story by the, let's say, the Hindu community. So when they are doing that, it's not like the immediate, I don't see immediate changes, but it's like starting from a position where they have started claiming it. If you go like 20 years back, maybe these things were not happening. Right? So there are many festivals which they have started doing, like performing and celebrating as they revive their movement. So for example, if you look at the first festival which I was talking about, it has a name called Ind movement, but that Ind has been misappropriated by, let's say, the Hindu community by connecting it with a god whose name is Indra in the Hindu scriptures. So by performing that festival, they are resisting these kind of misappropriations or demeaning of their festivals. And they very specifically claim that this is nothing to do with the Indra, right? So this is one way. And you are totally right, like one of the Adivasi scholars who died very recently, sadly, he said that the epistemic violence faced by the Adivasis is actually rooted in Brahmanical epistemologies. And he uses like many terms. He says that white imperialist has been replaced by the brown imperialist in India, mostly when it comes to Dalits and Adivasis. So these are the narratives they are using, not just to like resist distinct violence. And physical violence, direct violence is an everyday happening. You will see that the Indian state doesn't hesitate in declaring these people as anti-nationals for protecting their land. In fact, this whole movement, when it started in 2019, the Supreme Court of India directed the Indian government to displace 1 million Adivasis from their land. And that case is still pending. It's just that case just got halted because the people protested it this way. If they wouldn't have protested, they would have displaced like 1 million Adivasis in one go. So it's like an everyday thing which is going on. And it has nothing to, in my understanding, it has nothing to do with how the state is structured. In my understanding, the people who are dominating these institutions, they don't see these people as equal. They don't see these people as their own. They see them in that hierarchy. That these people don't have any claim on any aspect of Indian state or the land or the history. They are the ones who are going to define it. So these are the kind of things which are probably like the changes are taking very slow. And it is a big change that people have started giving up the identities which has been imposed on them, but declaring that they're not. This is like a big change, I think. This change happened within my community like 30 years back.
Yeah.
Now Adivasis are facing the same thing. So they are claiming their own identity now.
And it's still a continuous process
Yes.
until this point in time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So,
Yes, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering, how or can you make a statement on what this kind of means for decolonial theory in general? Because it seems like this is an example of a huge blind spot in academic ways of, approaching colonialism and decolonial theory. And this might be one of many, this might be a singular case. Can you make like is this kind of transferable to what?
Yeah, I think this is like something which is like happening now, where people are recognizing the drawbacks of these discourses, which has been mostly presented by the people, let's say in the context of India, who come from a very privileged dominating background. So they say their own story, and they define their own story. So these are the drawbacks. I don't know if you're like, yeah, like one of very like scholar who recently got published, he said that the British international legal thought has a very strong imprint of the British engagement with the caste ideology. They picked up those stories, those ideologies, and they implemented it at the global level. So the making of a racial hierarchy and a caste hierarchy is a very like, it's an overlapping thing. And I can only talk about in the Indian context, like I didn't not talk about the other broader framework. So where they're saying that, for example, in my community, scholars are saying that this whole concept that the Aryan doctrine is a European construct is a false narrative actually. It's a very much Brahmanical ideology, which the British Sanskrit scholars or European scholars from Germany, from any part of the countries, they picked up those narratives and they mix it or with the racial epistemologies or race theories which were existing in that part of the world. And what we see of the racial hierarchy at the making of at the global level is the coming together of these kind of ideologies together. So I think in the coming eras, these are the kind of things which are going to come up. I think in America, like in US, I think there's a very strong scholarship coming on like race and caste. And that's going to make a lot of difference. I think where the Dalit and the Black scholars are bringing out these, coming together of these problematic ideas. And there is a recent very movie cast, and it's I mean, like what like it said, brought out these complexities together, I think.
So Robert, you see.
Yeah, thank you. I was just, yeah. So thank you so much. This is an amazing learning experience. I had no idea for most of the things. So I've got a few questions. One is I'm interested about the language revitalization you mentioned, because you mentioned that there is 705 communities. So that there must be a lot of languages, I would believe. So how would that work? And how is it connected to the international movements for language revitalization? Because that also is connected to culture and knowledge keepers. So language revitalization is so key to embodied connection and everything. So I was just wondering if you know the international aspect of the language revitalization and how they are handling it in such a big environment. And second is the land back movement. That's also connected to the language revitalization and water stewardship, probably, because there are so many dams in India, and there's the mines, but also the water, and I see that that's the inland area, which must be like the water must be plenty. So how would that also affect with the global movements and water connection? So I'm just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the Adivasi people are like following a lot the indigenous movements going all around the world. And when I was there, like every time I was asked about the indigenous movement, how the indigenous people are fighting their battle out there in Canada. And they follow it on YouTube. There are scholars who are engaging with the indigenous scholars here in Australia, in New Zealand. So there's a lot of change going on. And regarding the language vitalization, I mean, not all of the communities are doing that. I will not say that because some of them are like very small communities. But the community I work with is like one of the largest tribe within the Adivasi communities. So they are like very much focused on reviving. They don't have their script, so they are mostly using the Hindi script. But Hindi is not their language. In fact, Hindi is never a language. It's like a coming together of different dialects, northern India and all parts of the world. And so it's like, yeah. So they are struggling the same. The Indian state is imposing Hindi on them by making them learn and write in Hindi. But the ground activists and scholars are like working on it to revive it. There are many community leaders who are coming from the community who are working on it to like they run small schools and everything. So where they teach the kids, in the mother tongue. These are some of the things which are happening in terms of like language revitalization. Regarding like laws and governance system, there is a very strong movement that they wanted to revive that. And there is a very strong resistance from the Indian state as well to kill those laws and governance systems. So there is something called the Indian state has imposed like a governance system called the Panchayati Raj institution. So it's like a 3-layer institution, which they call the decentralization of power. But in doing so, what they do is like they put the Adivasi people's village assembly at the lowest level. So basically that village assembly has no power at all. But this institution has been presented to them as something a democratic and decentralized government structure. So yes, language, laws, governance systems, culture, festival, everything is going on there. Regarding like resources, I mean, it's not hard to understand how the state takes away the land and resources. If you go back like 10 years back, there's a very strong, very movement, which we call the Niyamgiri movement. It was about a whole mountain which was given to a South Korean steel company to mine. There is like a whole 10-year battle which the people fought to take back that mountain. And they worship that mountain as their god. So I think you can understand it in the context of a case here, Canada. A lot of scholars have written also about it. So I think the fight of the indigenous people in any part of the world is very similar, whether in terms of fighting back for their identity, for their land, for their resources, for their laws and government systems. Yeah, but they are definitely exchanging with each other.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Arvind. I really appreciate it. I had a chance to participate, I guess, to another talk of you, and it's so amazing, like so many things into each other, like stories and laws, philosophy. There is one question that I am really trying to articulate, still I can't, so please bear with me. If it didn't make any sense, just skip, okay?
You can always skip questions.
So I'm thinking to make sense how there are two concepts here that I'm really struggling with. There is this system, caste system. It is a precise system of putting people into categories somehow. And now I learned that there are relationships between traditions, religions, you become there, and there should be some manual for upper class to say that, okay, you are pure to this much percentage or something like that,
Oh, that makes sense. That also exists, by the way. There is a manual.
And I think thousands of years is behind it, like whatever or not. These are my thoughts, or just And I see some connections between this and law as well. So it could be the law of the time. I don't know. This is so meticulous to say that what do you eat? What do you do? This is the exact same thing that we are doing now in society, but it's more harsh. You know? But I'm thinking about, so we are having such a system that somehow emerged, perhaps gradually. And there is this power struggle or contest over something like the story that there was a kingdom, but it has been taken away. By who and what happened? Who are these Hindu people? And I'm thinking about maybe two questions are here. What is the history and the story of creation of this thing, whatever that you can help me. And also, how do you connect that to law? Like, how these two sit together?
Those are small questions.
I bet you're about half an hour to answer that.
No, I think that's one of the most important questions, which I am trying to figure out. Most of the people are like trying to figure out, and that's what it takes you to in the history. I don't call it legal history, and most of the people around me are dealing with legal history. But I am dealing a lot with history. This conception that the caste system was indigenous to India, we reject it. We don't consider it. Caste system has never been indigenous to India. I mean, nothing against the Brahmin people. But if you look at the history, the tradition which you call the Brahmanical tradition originated with the Vedic people. It's the people like who are writing Vedas mostly around 1400 BCE. And it's also a misconception that Hinduism was always present. If you look at the emerging scholarship now, you will find that around 500 BCE, there was no relationship between the indigenous traditions of India, which we call the Shramanic traditions, Buddhism, Jainism, Ajivkas, Lokayats, Charvaks, many traditions, Adivasi, tribal, many traditions. You can think of Buddhism because it's one of the most popular traditions. This idea that Buddhism, Jainism are small sister traditions of Hinduism is a very total wrong idea propagated by British state and let's say the Prakash discourses. Around 500 BC, at the time of the Buddha, there was no connection between those two traditions. Vedic tradition was mostly developing in the area, let's say, Afghanistan, Iran. I mean, Iran, I'm saying because they were drawing a lot from Zoroastrianism. There is a huge interaction between the Vedic Sanskrit scholars and Zoroastrianism. So mostly they were situated in that region. Something happened in 326 BCE. Alexander came to that part of the world, and the patron the Vedic people or the Vedic priests were enjoying in that region got dismantled. So now they have to find new patrons. And in that whole process, you will see that they started migrating into India. And as they migrated, they came in a huge, long conflict between Buddhist tradition and the Vedic tradition. And out of that coming together, these whole Hindu scriptures have come into being. So there's like a whole long history. And wherever the Brahmins went as priests and occupied their spaces in kings' courts and everywhere, because in those times they were acting as advisors to kings also. So there are like 3 or 4 things which you need to understand about the Brahmanical tradition. So wherever they go, so there is something called Arivarta, the land of the Aryas. That's you will find in the ancient Hindu scriptures. But land of Aryas or Arivarta is not a defined category. Brahmins call an Arivarta as long as that land and the people follow the supremacy of the Brahmins, follow the Varna system, the caste system, and they recognize the supremacy of the Vedic scriptures. So these are 3 or 4 things which defines when a Brahmin will call a land as an Arivarta or the land of the Aryas. So wherever they go, what I'm trying to say here, as advisors to kings and emperors, they ensure that the caste system is established as the organizing form to govern the society. So there's a huge battle for at least like 800 years where the Buddhists and the Brahmins were interacting with each other. So Buddhism, like for example, is based on the idea of compassion, fraternity kind of ideas. It doesn't believe in the metaphysical world, more or less. Buddha never taught about this. So there's like a whole conversation, you need to understand how these whole traditions have been working together. And when the, yeah, I don't know, I can be long. But the caste system got solidified by the British. They made it the caste system as the ideology to go on in society. So you will see the colonial laws where they define that Dalits would only do menial jobs, dirty jobs. The Brahmins would be occupied as professors, lecturers, teachers, administrators. So they made the caste system more rigidified. That's why I'm saying that decolonial and de-Brahmanical approach is needed when you are thinking about what has happened gone wrong with the caste and the tribe issues in the Indian society.
Thank you.
I have one relatively easy and one difficult question. Let me start with the easy one, then you should feedback the second one. So the first one, and I feel a bit, after this short summary of long history, I want to bring you back to the kind of fight for self-governance and autonomy. I'm just wondering, it seems that the caste system is so well entrenched culturally, religiously, politically. I'm just wondering, are there any cracks in terms of the ruling elite at the moment, where these Adivasis could find allies? And what is the role of the legal system? If you look at the Canadian system, it seems that law and the legal system provide some instruments, right, at least for promoting claims for self-governance. I'm just wondering, whether the legal system is at least open in the Indian context. And the other one, are there any parts of the elites that might listen to these arguments? And Steve, it was your idea about, kind of universalist ideas, right? Equal rights. Do these resonate with part of, let's say, the scholarly elites, that are not from this community, but there might be, what would be the strategy, right, to win over at least parts of the governing and dominating elites to even listen to these kind of claims? Do you see in terms of a political struggle? So that was, hopefully it's a relatively easy quick question for you. And the other one goes back to Svenja's question. I'm just wondering, the title is also going beyond the colonial and postcolonial binary. What is this a case of, right? Yeah, in terms of the theory of decolonization and post-colonialism. I can see the continuity, right? So you see, it started before the colonial time, and in a way it's being reproduced into post-colonialism, and there's far more continuity in terms of these power structures, right? And so is this, you said, Robert, you mentioned to go beyond the binary, just whether I could push you a bit on this theoretical front.
Yeah, thank you. First question, okay. So, yes, there's a lot of improvement being done. I would not deny that these communities are not heard or nobody is listening to them. Obviously, there are scholars who are bringing out their voices. One of the major critique of ours is that, what's the word? The good people, the good scholars, let's say, they do produce good scholarship which bring out the problems, but they always erase the question of caste, which is the defining character. So there are a lot of good work has been done. If people would not have been listening, we wouldn't have a constitution which recognizes these historical wrongs. For example, I can criticize Gandhi. There's a lot of criticism in my community of Gandhi, but Gandhi was seen as someone who recognized these problems. Initially he denied, but by the end of his time, he did recognize that. And the same goes with the Adivasi leaders who were made part of that constitutional assembly. So the Constitution of India does answer some of the questions where it doesn't recognize and does provide provisions which protect the which tries to undo the historical wrongs. There are and that's where I think you will be able to understand the rise of Hindu nationalism. So this rise of Hindu nationalism is nothing but a push against the democratic changes brought by the Constitution, which recognizes and gives space to these communities in terms of reservation policy or maybe in some other forms. So Hindu nationalism is nothing but to undo the democratic changes which is brought today within the Indian society. Yeah, so I think I can answer to that long question in a short way. But there is scholarship, people recognize and also. What's the second question?
The second about your, you're going beyond colonial and post-colonial,
Yes.
right? And so can you give us a sense of where you want to go, you know, with the, if you then, in a way, take a lesson from your particular case, right, and speak to the, you know, very vigorous debates about colonialism and decolonialism, and why you think, you know, it's worth reconsidering the binary.
Yeah, one of the things like I'm struggling with is like, I mean, in this part of the world,
Mhm.
it's very clear, like the decolonial discourse makes sense. This land was never left by the colonialists, right? So that's what I've said, that it makes very much sense what post-colonial scholarship is saying. But in the context of societies like India, it doesn't make sense. It's a very narrow lens through which we are trying to understand the problems. Most of the post-colonial scholars, they don't go beyond the colonial. And that's where I think the problem arises. So when I can mostly talk about India, right? Every society has its own complexities, I think, and every society needs to like think about these discourses, frameworks in their own way. I can talk about India, and I totally see that there is a big flaw in the frameworks, methodologies presented by the South Asian scholars dominating the Western academia or Indian academia. So, in my understanding, yes, there is a need to go beyond this colonial and post-colonial binary. Otherwise, we are going to face problems like what we are looking into in the rise of interfascism, right? So, yeah.
If you have a theoretically minded moment, you know, that would be a fascinating article to write, right? To reflect on the Indian context and then the way use this as a lens to critically engage with scholarship in the West.
I mean, I recently read a paper from Australia, Professor Margaret Davis, like she published with me, and she was talking about how there is a need to decolonize legal pluralism, the way we think legal pluralism. So what she's saying is that the way we are thinking about legal pluralism is actually, I mean, she has talking about Australian society mostly, and she has given like, you know, the problems and the drawbacks.
Oh, yes, thanks. Yeah, just adding to that conversation about the binary. I wonder if it's a binary of, well, it is also a binary of colonial, post-colonial, but also the binary of self and other, master-slave dialectic, like that binaristic system too. I mean, it's been happening in other arenas, right? Of course, intersectionality is one piece of it, but also I do see, like, especially with global mobility and movement and around climate crisis, around any reason, I think even in the Canadian context, it's starting to make less and less sense, because what do you do with, like say in the Okanagan, where there's many Indigenous nations who are enjoying various levels of sovereignty and economic revitalization or vitalization. And then like in the Okanagan, a big Sikh movement coming in, or Sikh population that's established there and has farmed a lot of the land around the reserves and are also seeking to prosper from that land. So even there, like, there's no like clear self and other from a white Western perspective, or even from an Indigenous one, because the colonizer is like a second, third, fourth level, and not necessarily a colonizer, but an uninvited guest nonetheless. So yeah, I guess the binary of all sorts of like this kind of post-colonial framework, but also all sorts of kind of philosophical binaristic modalities are disrupted.
Yeah. One of the things like comes to my mind is like, especially when I came to Canada, like what I'm looking at is like, I'll try to explain it, like talk about it in the context of, let's say, the caste system. So it's not a system which just came into being in 100 years. I mean, many communities have migrated to India and they got absorbed in this system in somewhere. But these two communities, like let's say Dalits and the Adivasis, they have always remained at the bottom. So what I'm looking at the Canada So I'm thinking, I don't want to like say it openly. It's a making of hierarchy, what I see. All these people coming from South Asia and parts of the world.
Mhm.
I mean, they are getting absorbed in that hierarchy. Who is more closer to the colonial narrative? Are you closer to the colonial state, the Canadian colonial state? And the more closer you will be, you are going to benefit from that. And the indigenous people are always going to be, at least in the current times, they are not the ones who are making any decisions with respect to the land or economy, defense, whatever. So I think it's a hierarchy in making, which I think I'm seeing in this part of development. I was like thinking about the US, and I was just thinking like, we use the term original inhabitants for the Adivasi people. And one scholar has used the term of original outsiders, let's say for the upper caste or Brahmanical community. They are the ones who are deciding who is belong to that land or not. And Adivasi people are just standing there straight. The same thing is happening in US. The original outsiders are defining who belong to that land, who doesn't. And they are indigenous people just being, lying at the bottom of the social pyramid. I don't like if I've answered that question, but something to think about.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, we have to come to a close, but Claudia, and then maybe two more, and then, we come back to, okay, three, and then we come to the last. Sorry, you have one task is coming your way, but Claudia,
Yeah.
Anna, and Paul.
Thank you. Well, fascinating the presentation. And mine is kind of a common question. And I am originally from Chile, a country in Latin America. And when I came to Canada, for me, the question about class was central to my scholarship. And I was told over and over again that class wasn't actually a thing in the Canadian context. And years passed by, and I moved away to look at the world through class. But what your presentation brought to me was that sometimes these frameworks that have the purpose of liberation, let's say, suppress other lenses to look at the world. And what I'm hearing from you is that narrative discourses, theories about decolonization are not helpful just to understand the reality of the Adivasi and their struggles and their way of understanding their futures. And I think talking about the binary is rather than a binary, you are looking at perhaps revitalizing a lens that has been quite hidden or just marginalized to understand the world. And I think fascinated because in my context, we always do this in Chile. We classify people for the way they dress, they speak, the school they went to. We don't have it in the legal system, but we do have it on our everyday life. And that's going to determine the kind of life you are going to have. So for example, indigenous people in Chile, we don't have representation of indigenous people across classes. They are basically, with some few exceptions, they are located in the lower classes. And that's also determining what is the value of put to their struggle epistemologies and so on. So it's not really a question, but just a comment to say that I think what happened there is something that is really valid. Because in a way, I think we have privileged some narratives and theories in the academy for good reasons. But the consequence of that is really not really making spaces for other perspectives. And I think is the central value that I see in the research global.
Thank you.
I have a few things. One is in response to what you said. The way I see it is it's an expansion of the colonial project. It's like, my very presence here is I am a part and a parcel already, whether I accept it or reject it wholly. I am here to extend. I'm a part of that extension of the colonial project on this land, which has been colonized for years. And I come from a colonial context. So it's still that same old colonial project of transferring indentured labors to another part of the world. It's never been different. Now it's different because I am paying to be here. Back then, people were transported as slaves. I don't see much of difference in that continuity of the ideological underpinning of that thing of colonial projects expansion, because only for the white people now to continue to have this effective control over this land would be impossible. They need others to be a part of it. I don't know if sorry, but yeah, I just said it out loud, whatever I feel. The other thing, I have a question for you is, how, as a person trained in TIS also, how have you managed to make this presentation without mention of Ambedkar, the Great? But I see a lot of mention of Gandhi, so I'm like, kind of, what's going on in here?
Thank you very much. Just for volunteer, of course, we bring you up in and then, you have time a bit to reflect from.
I just want to express my appreciation for what you've been saying. I can't formulate my question. I was struck by the way you're balancing, you call it ideology critique and historical sociology, and how can you do that at the same time? So that's how are you doing? But I'm struck by your exception. India exception doesn't apply here, maybe. Doesn't make any sense to me. But that's the problem, I think, central colonialism and binary. But the history of hierarchy. And we're all in these hierarchical societies of different kinds. Some of them are colonial, commonality, I would frame, for the core of the poetic frames, it's about colonialism. Then about the extraordinary diversity of hierarchy and its relationship in the Indian case to nationalism. And so, for me, part of the problem of the colonial discourse, anti-colonial discourse, is that it selects particular cases in relation to the self-other binary, whereas, and therefore tends to neglect a top-down binary, and you're dealing with both there. And I find that impressive and very difficult.
All right,
Trying to make
so
sense.
you have a whopping 5 minutes to, respond to.
No, thank you, Kalpana, for bringing that. I think, since I came to Canada, people are more aware about Gandhi. So most of the time, I just like to erase the complexities. I don't say a lot of things. But yes, Ambedkar, is one of the main architect of the Constitution of India. I came from the Dalit community. And if you are interested, you can read the conflict between Gandhi and Ambedkar.
B.R. Ambedkar.
So he has written a book called Annihilation of Caste, where that book or that thought came into his disappointment with leaders like Gandhi, who were not ready to recognize the problem of caste. So there's a whole debate between both these people. So, but thank you for bringing that. But yeah, thank you for listening and for your questions. I think I've learned a lot from your questions, and they made me think a lot. And probably I will get over the complexities as I progress. So thank you for your comment.
Thank you, Arvind, for